So then we are back with the more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayeric lineage, so then we can understand the time of the end. As per Mashiyach the prophet, we find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Mashiyach laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Mashiyach the prophet, we always ask ourselves why then the prophets were murdered. And as we study this topic, then we should ourselves then becoming very cautious as far as understanding the holy instructions and layer them properly as the prophets and also the apostles or the Shilishim did, as far as giving on the information to somebody else. So then there are a few understandings that we should be very acquainted ourselves with, and then what Mashiyach Shaul has said in the city of Philippi. When we read, for instance, what then Mashiyach Shaul was explaining, or then Paul, understandably he was focusing his going over there because he was sent to those people who were lost. What does it mean? Let's then understand firstly what the Mashiyach has done and the importance of placing the Mashiyach always firstly in every conversation regarding the instructions, the Torah, and whatsoever we read. The Mashiyach always must be mentioned first. As we read then the Torah and the prophets and the writings, and then the Teshuvah, or then the return of the Mashiyach, and the Shilishim, or the apostles, the Mashiyach always comes first. And then Mashiyach Shaul was explaining in such a way that was absolutely very easy understanding. The Mashiyach, when he came, he was rejected by his own people. They used to make schemes in order to have the Mashiyach then put down. And he was placed in many schemes. The leaders of the law of the time, they were hateful towards the Mashiyach because what the leaders wanted was the absolute power of teaching and then manipulating the people. They wanted at 100%, not 99.9%, but 100%. And then when the Mashiyach came, he was very clear. He came for those people who were then those who were placed aside because of these insatiable desire of leaders to have the power. So the Mashiyach came for those people who were aside. That's why then when we hear the Mashiyach speaking, he was then speaking of himself as the prophecy of Isaiah or Yirmiyahu has stated it. He came to those who were then the very people who lacked the understanding of the Torah because of the manipulations of the people of the law. Thus, when we read then Mashiyach Shaul speaking in Philippi, we then understand what he said. Though some of them they were speaking in pretense, others were speaking in truth, then the Mashiyach was being preached. So what he was saying is this: the Mashiyach is always on top and first. It's not the Torah, not the prophets, not the writings, not Teshuvah or Revelation. It is the Mashiyach coming first. When the Mashiyach comes first, then the rest of it, each of them goes into their places. So then, we can't ever compare ourselves with what the Mashiyach has done, under absolutely any condition, neither in thought, in teaching, or any other way. If by any moment we compare ourselves with the Mashiyach and say, if the Mashiyach could do, then we can do also. If we do this, we are placing ourselves in a prideful standing, and then we make ourselves very vulnerable and then we do not understand the rest of it. Though we can have the entire knowledge, if we don't have the Mashiyach, it simply does not produce fruit. And the more the Mashiyach shows up, the more people want control. There are some places, some congregations, they act as the German Gestapo. They want absolutely every situation under their control. They want to know where you are going, what you are doing, with whom you are doing, what kind of a content you are teaching or showing or sharing. So then the Mashiyach is explaining in a way that those who have the basic knowledge, they can understand the understandings as far as the Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, the spring feast, the autumn, and Teshuvah, and the returning of the Mashiyach, because he then gives at no charge. And then, trusting in Ruach HaKodesh, when the situation then is not lined up, at some point he is going to take care of it. Now, the problem is, if we don't mention of the Mashiyach, then we are neglecting his own order of speaking of himself. So then, there we were, reading then Paul or Mashiyach Shaul explaining of those people who were then cast aside, those people who were then abandoned, those people who were then under the control of the leaders of the law of the time. For those the Mashiyach came for. Was it not then Shimon and the other apostles, or then the Shilishim, they went before then the elders, and they were rejected and beaten. And then they came out of the judgment place, and they were glad because they were beaten up by those who were against them, and they were showing the ways of the Mashiyach. So in today's society, there is then a very delicate balance of doing what the Mashiyach is saying, and at the same time respecting those in leadership. Now, the Mashiyach comes first, not the leadership. And this is what then Mashiyach Shaul is explaining. So then, when we gather around and we speak of the Mashiyach, we always want to lift up his name. You always to place him in a higher standards. When we read, for instance, Revelation, we understand, and there was then half hour of silence in heaven, because no person was worthy to receive then the Megillah and break its seals. So the Mashiyach is the top. So then, those people or groups or congregations who are then trying to control 100% what people are doing, then there is a red flag that must be lifted, because those people who are then understanding what the Mashiyach has done and the prophecies and the layers thereof, they must be given a certain limit of liberty to do their work. So then, as far as we can understand from the holy instructions, Mashiyach Shaul was explaining to those people who were very unfortunate, because he said himself, when he was speaking to the leaders of Israel outside of Jerusalem, even they themselves were against Mashiyach Shaul or Paul. And then came to a point he abandoned them. And then he went to those people who were cast aside and distraught, and they were dismayed because of so much control the people of the law wanted. And Mashiyach Shaul simply, he gave them the plain understanding of the holy instructions, the Torah and the writings and the prophecies. And then the leaders, they were very envious. They were absolutely angry. So then, while we are in this earth doing our duty, we should never, under any condition, neglect of speaking of the Mashiyach. There are some basic knowledges that must be gathered, but very basic, and then given on the information somebody else, thus then producing fruit. If the flow of these is then cut or interrupted, you can be sure of it, trouble comes. So then, next time we're going to evaluate more of the situation, and then making somewhat a military report as far as what's going on with Daniel the 11th chapter and the movements of armies. They are already at play. Because as we have read this morning, the leader of the Soviets and then the party that was against him was shot dead this morning. So then, as we can understand, the military strength of the Soviet Union is returning, and they are not playing games. I want to evaluate this more because as we read it in Daniel the 11th chapter, we understand there are sections of it related with the northern kingdom and the influence of arms for sale for then Egypt mostly, and then the gathering of ISIL in Egypt, and then later on marching down south and then conquering the northern portion of Africa. However, there are a whole lot more many explanations that should be given, but at least the basics of step by step you understand as you read Daniel the 11th chapter. Only don't be confused as far as northbound versus northern kingdom or southbound versus southern kingdom. Have to understand how to read it. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.